Welcome to the Fridge and Pantry Review, 35 everyday products for everyday people. This is part 2, and now we're about to jump into milk alternatives and breakfast foods, and we're also going to cover a mini label reading lesson. And we're going to begin with milk alternatives and breakfast foods. The first thing you're going to notice when you start to look at plant-based milk alternatives that there are so many of them now. It used to be pretty much soy milk, and now you go to the shops and there are 100 different options. I've chosen to talk about 2 in this particular review because otherwise I'll be here, as I said, all week. And so the 2 I'm going to talk about are soy milk and rice milk, but there are a whole lot of other options, and I will be talking about them down the track in future reviews. These are my 2 favourite dairy milk alternatives based on flavour and appearance. The rice milk is my personal favourite, and I find that most people who are coming off dairy really like the flavour of the rice milk. And also in terms of cooking and appearance and stuff, it's quite easy to substitute in your cooking as well. Just like soy milk, most of these dairy milk alternatives you can pretty much substitute one for one with your cow's milk, but they all do have a different appearance, a different texture, and a different smell and flavour to cow's milk, which obviously because it's not coming from a cow, but they also have a different smell and taste to each other as well. And if you're used to it and you substitute it in a recipe, you're not going to notice. But for example, someone who's a hardcore dairy lover will not like, coconut milk used in a particular recipe, for example. They're really going to find that smell and taste of that is going to be off-putting. Whereas something like rice milk is, I find, pretty innocuous, so it's not really noticed as much. So what do you need to look for when you're shopping for a plant-based milk alternative? Well, if you like soy milk, and I think soy milk's usually a good option for people who really like the appearance and the thickness of cow's milk, because it's probably the thickest in terms of it's the most viscous, so it feels sort of the thickest, but it's also the most white and least see-through out of all the plant-based milk alternatives. And so if you are looking at a soy milk, the thing to look for is that you're getting a milk which is made from whole soybeans. And if you start looking at the labels next time you're in the shops, you're going to notice that some of them don't use whole soybeans. Some of them just use the protein extracted from the soybean and then a whole range of other additives to it. So the first thing you want to do is choose one that's made from a whole soybean. And if you live somewhere in Australia, for example, where we can actually put on the labels that the product is genetically modified free or whatever, then that's cool. But if you're living anywhere else in the world which doesn't have that freedom of labelling, then going for an organic choice will let you have one which is organic, which is pesticide free and free of GMOs as well. Okay? And same with your rice milk. Again, just check that it's actually made from whole brown rice, because often there can be just other ingredients in there that you don't necessarily want. And the next thing I'd like to point your attention to, just while I'm talking about ingredients, is if you have a food intolerance or a specific dietary need, please always check the labels, because sometimes the milk alternative that you buy can be not just rice milk, for example. The rice milk that I really love is rice milk, and it's also got chickpeas added. So for most people, chickpeas are innocuous, but if you've got a food intolerance and you're really sensitive to the fibre in the chickpeas, for example, then this one might not work for you. But there are a whole range of options, and even from the same company which makes this particular one, which is just plain brown rice, okay? And it still tastes lovely. So you might just have to read a few labels and see which ones are suitable for you if you've got another food intolerance. And again, like with the soy milk, a lot of them have other things added to them. So for example, if you're on a gluten-free diet, this particular one wouldn't be suitable because of the barley. However, just read the labels because there are so many options now and a lot of them will be suitable. So just keep looking on the labels and you'll find that information in the ingredient panel. This ingredient panel here is often found under this nutrition information panel, which is this one here. So the main thing people are concerned about when they switch to a plant-based milk is, but what about the protein and what about the calcium? And so let's just start comparing some labels here so you can get some context for this. Dairy milk has around 3.3 grams of protein per 100 mils, and soy milk has about 3.2 per 100 mils, and rice milk has about half that at 1.5 grams per 100 mils, and that's only this particular rice milk which has been enriched with chickpeas, and that's what's given it the extra protein boost. Okay, so a conventional rice milk which is made just with rice without chickpeas would have less protein again. Okay, and as you can see here in the label, the company have explained the difference, and they're saying this one is 1.5 grams per 100 mils, whereas their conventional plain rice milk is 0.3 grams per 100 mils. Now, you're going to be saying, oh, but what about almond and all of these other milks? I encourage you to go and look at the labels because you're going to see all sorts of ridiculous nutritional claims. So always start looking at the panels themselves and the ingredients list and start making sure that the claim that is made actually adds up to the numbers that are on the box about what's inside the box. Okay? So the next thing that people worry about is calcium. Where are they going to get their calcium from if they're not having dairy milk or any dairy products? And the great thing is nowadays most of your plant-based milk alternatives are calcium enriched. Not all of them are. So again, just have a look on all the labels to make sure and have a look on the table. It's on this sort of nutrition panel here which you'll usually see that. And pretty much when they're enriched, they're generally enriched so that they're on par with the dairy milk. So for example, a glass of rice milk will give you the equivalent amount of calcium as you would get from a glass of dairy milk, so you wouldn't be shortchanged there. And this particular soy milk is enriched with a little tiny bit more, but basically the take-home message is you can buy calcium enriched plant-based milks, so you can still get the calcium and you don't have to be worrying about that. The other benefit, of course, as well is if you're looking for products which don't have cholesterol in them, or if you've got an intolerance to lactose, then your plant-based milks are free of both of those things, where the dairy milk isn't. Okay, so this is a good place to begin. Also, you'll find that some plant-based milks might be enriched with additional nutrients. So things like vitamin B12, for example, and vitamin D might be useful depending on the vitamin D, which part of the world you live in. Some countries enrich their milks with vitamin D. Not many of our plant-based milks are enriched with vitamin D here in Australia because we get a lot of sunshine. But the vitamin B12 is an interesting one, especially if you're following a completely plant-based diet, so if you're vegan, for example. Of course, the amounts that it's enriched with may or may not be enough for your diet, and generally I'd be recommending vegans to be supplementing to make sure, and testing, getting their bloods tested to make sure their B12 levels are adequate, because deficiencies can be quite serious. But again, this little bit of enrichment here might be suitable and useful to your dietary needs. So how do you use these alternative milks? Pretty much like you'd use a regular milk. An example of where I use the rice milk is in the spicy chai smoothie, which is in my free recipe ebook, and I'll have the link to that at the end, so if you're interested you can download that for yourself and get this recipe. But you can do all sorts of combinations here. It's pretty easy. Put your favourite things in the milkshake and blend it up really, and it'll take on a bit of the taste of the plant-based milk. So soy milks will taste a little nutty, which I used to love, and the rice milk will be pretty sweet, and all your other plant-based milks will have their own characteristic flavour as well. So begin playing with them and see which one you like the taste of the most and which suits your dietary needs as well, especially if you have a need for some of the extra things that the milks are enriched with. I also just use the milk on the muesli or cereal or in porridge, for example. In summer we like to make muesli, and this is my current favourite muesli, though now that it's winter here I'm using just plain oats and making porridge. And this particular brand recently switched to nut free, which is still lovely, though it's got quite a few sultanas in it, so you may or may not like that. If nuts work for you, you could actually add nuts to that as well. So you can always add all sorts of things and make all sorts of interesting breakfast depending on how much time you have in the morning. Sometimes some of these packaged whole foods, it doesn't take a lot of effort to add a spoon of some of the seeds I'm going to show you, for example, and so you can still add even more nutrition to your breakfast without a lot of extra time involved. But in summer, when I've got a bit more time, I like to chop up some fresh fruit and put it in our muesli as well. Another place that I use that particular muesli again is the pear and cherry crumble recipe, which you'll find in the free recipe book, the Everyday Food Ideas for Everyday People. So again, I'll give you that link at the end. And I basically do it because it's sweet, it's spiced, and I don't have to change it. I just add that in the recipe, really easy. So another breakfast alternative, if you like cereals, and especially if you like, your puffed cereals for the texture of them, is amaranth. Amaranth is a gluten-free alternative, but always, if gluten is an issue for you, you need to actually check to make sure that the product that you buy was actually made in a gluten-free facility, so it's free of the traces as well of gluten. But in terms of taste and texture, I love it. I think it's really cool. It's light and fluffy. It really doesn't have an overpowering flavour at all. And one of the things that I like to do for the kids is just sprinkle a little bit of cacao on top or carob and our plant-based milk alternative, and you have an instant chocolate puffed cereal for breakfast, and the kids love it. So, and I love it too, I've got to say. It's nice to have for those fun days. So what you might add to those base cereals is something like linseed, or here it's LSA, linseed, also called flaxseed, sunflower and almond meal. It's quite a popular mix, and this particular one comes pre-ground. Now ideally you might love to grind your own, because then everything will be fresh and less likely to be oxidized. That's great. But if you don't actually have a blender which is capable of doing that, this is the next best option, and you can store it in the fridge after you've opened it, and all you do is sprinkle a spoonful over your cereal or in your smoothie, and you're adding an extra dash of nutrition to the meal. With the flax seeds, you're getting some really great plant-based omega-3s, which are your good fats, so good for your brain, things like that. And with the almond meal, you're getting some minerals, because nuts are a good source of minerals. And so it's a nice way of adding extra nutrition to your meals. Another thing that you can add really easily is chia. And what I do is I add some chia and some amaranth to the muesli in our little muesli container in the cupboard. So I actually don't have to blend them all every morning. It's pretty much there when I pour it into our bowl. Chia is a great little seed. It's really packed with nutrients. It's got some good minerals in there. It's a reasonably good source of protein for the relatively small amount that you use, and again it's a really rich source of plant-based omega-3s, so again your essential fats. And the good thing about chia is because it's a whole seed, I find it's easier to, as I said, pour it through my cereal. That way in the morning we've got it ready to go. Whereas something like the LSA, which is ground up, you're probably going to want to keep that in the fridge a bit more. So it's less convenient to mix through your cereal already. So it depends on how short for time you are. Taste-wise, it doesn't have an especially overpowering taste, which is why it's a really good thing that you can add to your cereals and just get a little bit of extra nutrition. What it will do is if you leave it standing in your milk or your smoothies, as with the LSA, the linseed, the flaxseed and the chia will thicken up and make the drink a little more jelly-like. Not quite like jelly, but that'll be the best way to describe it. So another nice thing to add to your cereals are other nuts and seeds. So you've got so many options here, it's not funny, but among the favourites are walnuts, almonds, pepitas, some Brazil nuts, cashews, hazelnuts, sesame seeds, in addition to like the chia seeds and the linseed that we've already talked about, and sunflower seeds. There's heaps of options. So if nuts work for your diet, they're a great little addition. Chop up a few and just sprinkle them in your cereal, and that'll give you a bit more oomph and help your breakfast last that little bit longer. Walnuts are also a great option if you're looking for plant-based sources of good fats, because they've got a really good omega-3, which is the good fat, to omega-6 ratio as well. And lastly, don't forget to have frozen fruit on hand. So if you're the sort of person that attracts gnats around your fruit bowl because you just don't really eat the fruit and you buy it just because you feel like it should be there, having some frozen fruit in the freezer is really handy. And the other thing I like to do with the frozen blueberries is, while it's winter, for example, we're having a warm breakfast, I'll make up porridge and then I'll sprinkle the frozen blueberries in the porridge, and that'll help cool down the porridge, so that way it doesn't burn our mouths when we go to eat it. And so we sort of get the best of both worlds. We're getting some fruit, especially something like blueberries, which are beautifully rich in antioxidants, and we're also getting a warm breakfast. So keep this in mind. And you can, of course, you can add them to smoothies if you prefer smoothies, or you could just thaw them and eat them like that if you wanted to as well. There's heaps of options, but it's a really handy thing to have on hand in the freezer for either at the end of the week before you go shopping when the fruit bowl is empty, or if you know yourself well enough to know that any fresh fruit you buy is just going to end up as a gnat attractant. Okay. Up next are the lunch and dinner options. So if you would like some quick ideas, make sure you click on the link to watch the next video.